Norton, and we are here at the Spirit of 76 Museum. I am with Jenny Arts, director of the Main Street Wellington. We thought it would be fun to do a few short videos about some of the things here at the museum because we've been closed. Hopefully we'll be able to reopen at some point. Well, at some point we will reopen, but I'm not sure whether it'll be a month or 2 months, but we're giving it a try. I'm holding here a Wellington Cheese Festival shirt, and you may want to know how this shirt is related to this gentleman who is named Sidney Warner. Now, Mr. Warner, I think, looks like a very, very distinguished man. He was actually born in Connecticut in 1829 and came to Ohio when he was about 10 years old, and he lived in Huntington Township, or in the little village of Huntington, which was almost as big as Wellington was at the time. If you've seen some other videos or have been to the museum, you'll know that when the railroad came to Wellington, it was the hot place to be. Mr. Warner and several other families from Huntington moved to Wellington because it turned out to be a much bigger, I don't want to say city, but a bigger town than what Huntington was. And they wanted to be in the middle of all of the growth that was happening in Wellington. Mr. Warner then was 40 years old when he came to live in Wellington, and he organized the First National Bank of Wellington in 1864, which, if you know your history, was the end of the Civil War. He was the first president of the bank, and he remained that for another 40 years. He was a Lorain County representative to the Ohio General Assembly once he got into politics, and he served 3 terms as treasurer of the state of Ohio. I still haven't told you how he's connected to the Cheese Festival. Wait for it. He was a partner in the Hoare, Warner and Company, which concentrated on establishing a cheese industry. Yes, in and around Wellington. They helped to organize all of the farmers that had dairy cows and a lot of milk to start producing cheese. And then their company took it and sold it. And they shipped a lot of it overseas. And that is one of the ways that he and Mr. Hoare became wealthy, although he was fairly wealthy before they started the Hoare Warner Company. Now, some of you may have been past Mr. Warner's home. When he came to Wellington, he built a beautiful home on South Main Street. Have you guessed which one it is yet? It is now the Norton Eastman Funeral Home. Now, I have a personal connection to that because my husband, Craig Norton, grew up in that house. And I've always known it as Craig's house, not Mr. Warner's house and not the funeral home. But anyway, I think he's just a very distinguished man. He did pass away in 1908 at age 79, and he's buried here in Wellington in the Greenwood Cemetery. Now, here's a couple facts for the Did You Know. Did you know that between 1866 and 1912, there were more than 40 cheese factories operating in southern Lorain County? Now, when I was growing up and they used to tell me about cheese factories, I was thinking big buildings and producing cheese like that we do now. But a lot of the cheese factories were actually dairies where they made the cheese right there on their farm. Then they sold it to Mr. Warner, Mr. Hoare, and then they sold it from there. So when we say that there were 40 cheese factories, they were not necessarily big buildings. There were some here in town, but a lot of them were little farm dairies and cheese-making establishments. Think of it that way. Don't think of it as big factory kinds of places. Okay, during the time of the cheese boom, a building boom developed in Wellington in the 1870s, and several brick stores were built, and several brick Victorian homes were built. As you know, Mr. Warner's home on South Main Street is a big brick Victorian home, probably constructed about this time or a little bit earlier. Because of the demand for brick, Mr. C.W. Hemingway's plant produced 1.5 million bricks a year for several years. Then the Wellington Machine Company developed brick making machines, which cut down on the number of people who worked at the factory, and then gradually the demand for the brick declined.